Thank you for joining us here on Skilled, Safe, and Trailblazing. If you're responsible for training the next generation of lab professionals or looking to level up your own expertise, you're in the right place. My name is Jessica Martin, and I'm a lab training professional with a background in chemical education research and community empowerment. I'm here to dive with you into the real-world strategies, expert insights, and game-changing discussions that will help us develop lab professionals who are skilled, safe, and trailblazing. In discussions about laboratory safety, the focus is often on acute harms: fires, explosions, instantaneous burning sensations, passing out, immediate responses to exposure. Health conditions resulting from chronic exposure are not necessarily considered. The causation is often much more difficult to identify, and in some cases, alarming symptoms can present themselves when everything else seems to be functioning in the lab as normal. As a researcher, I have found that the consequences of chronic exposure are far more concerning than that of acute exposure, in part because they feel like weird secrets we learn about after we've already been exposed for long periods of time. It also feels like an incredibly good reason to be nosy about the experiences of your colleagues. One of the most common stories told about unexpected chronic exposure is connected to the life and death of Marie Curie. When Marie Curie and her colleagues first began working with radium and polonium, they were operating at the edge of scientific knowledge, without any hazard profile, exposure limits, or safety standards. Curie and her growing number of colleagues handled radium salts directly, stored radioactive materials in desks and lab coat pockets, and worked in confined, unventilated spaces filled with radioactive dust. None of this was considered unsafe because no one yet understood the risks. However, this isn't really the whole story. There are two important themes in her experience that deserve further examination: the pride of the overworked researcher and the lack of institutional support. We'll start with the pride of the overworked researcher. All of us in STEM fields are familiar with this pride. The idea that true dedication is required to be a great scientist, and that dedication means exhausting yourself. The story of Marie Curie is often told to emphasize a great scientist who is willing to sacrifice all for her craft. In a biography of Marie Curie, written by her daughter Eve, the reader is enveloped in the high degree of admiration that Eve clearly had for her mother, the dedicated scientist. This book is linked in the show notes, and I've used it extensively to tell this story. In describing Marie's days as a student at the Sorbonne in Paris, Eve wrote,
Marie was not the only student who lived on 100 francs a month in the Latin Quarter. Most of her Polish comrades were as poor as she was. Marie did not admit that she could be cold or hungry. It never occurred to her that she was dropping with weakness and that her only disease was that of starvation.
In a letter to her brother during these years, Marie even wrote,
I regret only one thing, which is that the days are so short and that they pass so quickly. One never notices what has been done. One can only see what remains to be done. And if one didn't like the work, it would be very discouraging. It seems that life is not easy for any of us. But what of that? We must have perseverance and, above all, confidence in ourselves. We must believe that we are gifted for something and that this thing, at whatever cost, must be attained.
Marie went on to marry Pierre Curie, of course, and Eve tells us about how he had a very similar disposition. She captures that in a description of their first apartment together.
At one end of the table was Marie's chair, at the other, Pierre's. On the table were treatises on physics, a petroleum lamp, a bunch of flowers, and that was all. Pierre's existence tended toward one ideal only: to engage in scientific research at the side of the beloved woman who also lived for scientific research. Marie's was a harder life, because to the obsession of work was added the humble and tiring tasks of womankind.
Marie's health had been compromised early in her life. Among other things, her mother had suffered from tuberculosis for years and died in Marie's childhood. Marie herself had evidence in her lungs of tubercular lesions. After her lean college years, she entered her research career and married life in which her health continued to be tested. As Eve described it,
In the same year, within an interval of 3 months, Marie Curie brought into the world her first child and the results of her first research. Sometimes her acrobatic system of life seemed impossible to continue. Her health had deteriorated since her pregnancy. The Curie family doctor advised several months in a sanatorium, but the stubborn scientist listened absent-mindedly and flatly refused to obey. She had other things to worry about. She had the laboratory, her husband, her home, and her daughter.
in her later years, Marie developed severe cataracts, among other health problems. In a letter to her sister, she wrote,
Perhaps radium has something to do with these troubles, but it cannot be affirmed with certainty.
Marie wrote those words in 1920. She also insisted to her inner circle that they do not speak of her failing sight to anybody because she did not want the newspapers to publish that she was an invalid. Both Curies suffered from frequent and various illnesses that were a result of their genetics, their upbringings, and their personal drives toward overwork. To this was added high levels of radiation exposure that deteriorated the quality of their lives. While a sudden accident took Pierre's life earlier, Marie would die in her 60s from a collection of painful physical ailments. There is definitely an undercurrent within STEM that encourages us to hear these stories with admiration and see their exhaustion as our life goals. There is a different wave, however, asking why we can't use all this passion and intelligence to build means of exploring these scientific questions while also protecting our health and extending our lives. The second theme that emerges from Marie's experience is a lack of institutional support. One would imagine that scientists who are bringing in world renown and Nobel Prizes would be well supported by their home institutions. This, however, was not the case. Marie Curie chose the topic for her doctoral thesis after Henri Becquerel first announced his discovery that radium spontaneously produced energy. In 1897, she decided to explore this energy production and try to discover its cause. Eve described the initial search for a laboratory thus.
There remained the question of where she was to make her experiments, and here the difficulties began. Pierre made several approaches to the director of the School of Physics, with practically no results. Marie was given the free use of a little glassed-in studio on the ground floor of the school. It was a kind of storeroom, sweating with damp, where unused machines and lumber were put away. Its technical equipment was rudimentary and its comfort nil. Deprived of an adequate electrical installation and of everything that forms material for the beginning of scientific research, she kept her patience, sought and found a means of making her apparatus work in this hole. It was not easy. Instruments of precision have sneaking enemies: humidity, changes of temperature. Incidentally, the climate of this little workroom, fatal to the sensitive electrometer, was not much better for Marie's health.
It eventually became clear to the two scientists that if they were going to convince the world of the existence of both uranium and polonium found in minute quantities within pitchblende, they would have to extract it and characterize it. While pitchblende itself was extremely expensive, the crude residue that remained after treatment was quite cheap. By the way, the rest of us would call this hazardous waste. They just needed a place to perform this dirty, dangerous extraction work. After several attempts to convince the leadership of the Sorbonne to give them a suitable space, they went back to the School of Physics. Outside of the terrible little room described earlier, there was a courtyard that contained a wooden shack. As Eve described it,
An abandoned shed with a skylight roof in such bad condition that it admitted the rain. No floor, an uncertain layer of bitumen covered the earth. It was furnished with some worn kitchen tables, a blackboard which had landed there for no known reason, and an old cast-iron stove with a rusty pipe. The shed had one advantage. It was so untempting, so miserable, that nobody thought of refusing them the use of it.
they spent 4 years, from 1898 to 1902, working in this little dilapidated shed. To give you the visceral experience of how they lived, I will share a bit more of Eve's narrative on this shed.
In the summer, because of its skylight, it was as stifling as a hothouse. In winter, one did not know whether to wish for rain or frost. If it rained, the water fell drop by drop with a soft, nerve-wracking noise on the ground or on the work tables, in places which the physicists had to mark in order to avoid putting apparatus there. If it froze, one froze. It was almost better for Marie and Pierre to get used to the cruelty of the outside temperature, since their technical installation, hardly existent, possessed no chimneys to carry off noxious gases, and the greater part of their treatment had to be made in the open air, in the courtyard. When a shower came, the physicists hastily moved their apparatus inside. To keep on working without being suffocated, they set up drafts between the open door and windows.
The Curies would be awarded the Nobel Prize in Physics in 1903, and Marie would go on to win the Nobel Prize in Chemistry in 1911. And yet, she was not able to secure a proper laboratory from the Sorbonne to perform her research until 1914. In her later years, Marie wrote,
"It is true that the discovery of radium was made in precarious conditions. The shed which sheltered it seems clouded in the charms of legend. But this romantic element was not an advantage. It wore out our strength and delayed our accomplishment. With better means, the first 5 years of our work might have been reduced to 2, and their tension lessened."
So yes, even the scientist who would sacrifice all for her science was arguing for better working conditions. Around the same time that Marie was finally getting an appropriate laboratory space, a colleague of the Curies went on to make a discovery that would have a profound impact on many lives and on how the public perceived radium. The book, The Radium Girls, is linked in the show notes, and I've used it to fill in this part of the story. In 1913, Dr. Sabine von Sohacki invented a paint made luminous by the presence of radium, and he went on to establish a company that painted watch dials. Von Sohacki had been witness to the radium burns suffered by researchers while working with the Curies back in 1906 through 1908, and had even disfigured his own finger by chopping off its tip when he realized he had gotten some radium inside of it. The lab workers in the original plant founded in Orange, New Jersey, were provided with lead-lined aprons and ivory forceps to use when handling radium. However, von Sohacki was reportedly quite haphazard about his own protection, forgoing the use of this equipment, which influenced lab workers to take the same approach. Young women were employed for the dial painting itself, applying radium-based luminous paint to watch and instrument dials. They were instructed to lip point their brushes, shaping the bristles with their lips after each stroke. In these early years, some of these young women did report feeling ill, forming sores in their mouths and other worrying symptoms. Company leadership, including von Sohacki, put efforts into reassuring these young women that the paint was not hazardous, insisting that there was so little radium in the paint that it couldn't possibly be harmful. And yet a memory shared by one young woman from an encounter with von Sohacki in 1918 seems to suggest something a bit more sinister. It was rare that he was on the factory floor, so perhaps it was possible that he did not fully realize how these young women were instructed to work. He witnessed her perform her now expert-level lip pointing, and he told her not to put the brush in her mouth, as it would make her sick. The encounter was brief, the instruction contradicting everything she had been told, and so she dismissed it and carried on with her work. Of course, these young women were ingesting tiny amounts of radium every day. Over time, many developed devastating symptoms: jaw necrosis, anemia, spontaneous bone fractures, and bone cancers. Their bones quite literally disintegrated, while dentists and doctors scrambled for an explanation, leading to painful lives and horrific deaths. Their illnesses were physically unusual and not easily explained by how they lived their lives. And they clustered among a particular group that shared a physical space regularly and did similar work to one another. The companies they worked for brought several specialists for medical and toxicological investigations. However, they were motivated by covering up the connection between the radium work and the worker illnesses. It took lawsuits brought by 5 of these workers in 1927 to bring this issue into the public domain and force the company to take some accountability. Although it is important to note that the lawsuit was settled out of court in 1928, essentially because these women were dying. Publications were already beginning to appear before this company was even founded, in which worrying results of radiation exposure were already being reported. To this literature were added cases of the radium girls, as the dentists and doctors being called upon to treat them searched for a cure, or at least a cause for these ailments. These studies found that radium behaves like calcium, deposits into bone, and irradiates tissues from the inside out. The cases of the radium girls made public the accumulating evidence squirreled away in medical journals and laboratory observations that radioactive exposure was exceptionally dangerous. For researchers and safety professionals, the stories of Curie and the radium girls highlight the core challenge of emerging hazards. Danger exists long before it is recognized, and symptoms appear long before anyone knows what they mean. This experience also raises questions for me about what is normalized within academic research labs. These labs are called upon regularly to engage in cutting-edge research. Adding new knowledge to the field is how doctorates are earned, and how continuous funding is secured. Those engaged in wet lab research in STEM are accepting a higher degree of ambiguity around risk within their occupation relative to most other occupations. While some might consider Curie's attitude towards her symptoms extreme, it is a common attitude in the wet lab sciences that long hours in the lab and dedication to the pursuit of knowledge is critical to success. In my experience, fatigue, recurring infections, and various health conditions, often related to stress, are talked about with a bit of pride and are sometimes even worn as badges of honor. How different would Curie's story have been if this group of scientists working together had been more intentional about discussing their various growing health conditions? Rather than dismissing their symptoms as part of being dedicated scientists, what if they had more intentionally documented and compared conditions? And would this have prevented the unnecessary and excessive exposure unwittingly endured by the radium girls? This, of course, would suggest a very different type of buddy system, and brings me to a modern-day story about chronic exposure and the increasing onset of symptoms caused by an as-yet-to-be-recognized hazard.
So since my sensitization happened, I have not been able to teach in any lab space because I cannot stay in any lab space for more than 5 minutes. Seriously, I've counted it. 5 minutes before I start to feel irritation in my throat and lungs.
HBTU was first introduced into research labs in 1978. HA2U came along later in 1993. Then HCTU arrived in 2002. These are a family of peptide coupling agents that are used regularly in labs all over the world for peptide synthesis. Kate McNally was one such researcher, handling this common protocol in both a master's program and later in her PhD program.
When I was working in both labs for my master's and my PhD, I was doing peptide coupling, every day, multiple times a week. And we did have some standard operating procedures. I generally weighed out milligram amounts of the solids. So this was the peptide coupling agents, the FMOC protected amino acids, and they're like these white fluffy solids. I also weighed out the resin on the analytical balances because I used solid phase peptide synthesis. After that, I would bring all of the reagents, the solids, the resin, and the solutions, so the solvents, DMF or DCM generally. I also had an amine base that I would use, which was generally N,N-diisopropylethylamine. We called it DIPIA, and we would add this to the reaction to let the peptide bond formation reaction run. And I would combine all of those reagents in the fume hood. And after each peptide coupling agent reaction, I would wash the resin a couple times with DMF, This was all still in the fume hood. I would remove the FMOC protecting group with 20% pypyridine in DMF, and then I continued this sequence of steps until all of the amino acids of the peptide were incorporated. We had a peptide synthesizer, like an automated synthesizer, so I would also weigh out solid reagents, measure out large volumes of the solvents I've already mentioned to prepare these for the automated synthesis, but I would generally dissolve all of the solids in the liquids, put them in containers that I could seal, and then bring those sealable containers to the automated synthesizer. And then after I was done, whether I completed a hand coupling in a fume hood or if I brought all of the reagents to do a automated peptide synthesis production, I would then cleave the peptide with 20% HFIP and DCM. And then to remove all amino acid protecting groups, I would treat the peptide with an 18:1:1 TFA to TIPS to water solution. And after removing all of that solution, I would purify the peptides with reverse phase HPLC with a gradient of acetonitrile and water. And all of that, except for the HPLC, was conducted in a fume hood. And of course, the rotary evaporation was not in a fume hood as either.
I am including this level of detail from Kate because I think it is important to note that this was an experienced and knowledgeable person performing this work. And yet, there was one key difference in how Kate's master's lab and her PhD lab handled the peptide coupling agents, something that didn't even strike Kate as notable at the time.
So before working in a lab for my master's degree specifically, I did not know anything about peptide coupling agents, and I had no idea about any types of safety considerations for their use. Well, for both of my degrees, for the master's and the PhD, the exposure information was generally shared verbally and from verbal guidance to consult the SDS sheets. But then when working on my master's, right, I was taught by other group members how to weigh the peptide coupling agents out, and they taught me to keep these agents sealed in their containers, take them out of the freezer. We actually kept them in the freezer. I had to bring them to a hood where we had an analytical balance set up. I had to transfer the peptide coupling agents into a sealable flask and then make sure all of the containers, like the new container with the weighed out coupling agents and the source container, I had to bring them back to their respective places, either the hood or to the freezer while sealed. So basically they never were allowed to be exposed to lab air. I didn't think much of it. I was like, yeah, this is just a standard operating procedure. This is how we work with them. It didn't really click in my head that, oh, maybe there's a really important reason we're never exposing these lab chemicals to the lab space. When I got to my PhD program, I had mentioned that I was kind of surprised to see that the peptide coupling agents were handled differently. But what we did was we had all of our reagents out on a benchtop, and we would use an analytical balance that was right next to these containers of peptide coupling agents and amino acids, and then we would weigh them out with exposure to lab air. I am just going to go with it. And little did I realize that weighing out peptide coupling agents on the benchtop with no fume hood would lead to my own sensitization.
Hearing Kate describe these experiences as a safety professional is exasperating. And yet, with my experience as a researcher, is completely understandable and relatable. When safety practices are communicated as the rules we follow, we learn to follow those rules. But we don't necessarily learn the why behind the rules. Then, when we shift to a different environment with different rules, we learn to go with it, because we never learned the why. The discovery process that Kate went through with her own sensitization had her assembling an incredibly important puzzle.
I had no known allergies before graduate school. At one point, I thought I might be slightly allergic to shellfish because I had a bit of an allergic dermatitis reaction. But After that, I was able to eat shellfish no problem. And I bring this up because after being sensitized to the peptide coupling agents, I randomly became allergic to shellfish. But no, nothing before graduate school.
Shifting from someone who had never had to consider allergies to tracking her own sensitization progression meant paying more attention. I asked Kate if she saw any parallels to her story and that of Marie Curie.
Yes, I definitely do. I had never actually heard the details of her story, and I was very surprised to hear that she dismissed her symptoms and didn't see the connection between the compounds she was using and her personal health. I did the exact same thing, right? In the month leading up to my sensitization event, I had 2 instances of wheezing. One time I was in the lab room where we had group meeting, and one time I was in my car. I was actually driving 2 of my lab mates home. And in group meeting, I started wheezing, and I didn't think much of it because it didn't last very long, and group meeting was almost over, so I left the building, went home. It was no big deal. I thought, okay, maybe I'm having a weird irritation to some environmental allergen. But when I was driving my lab mates home, the wheezing was worrying me because the wheezing wasn't going away as I was driving them. Like, I think I started to wheeze a little bit when they first got in the car. I didn't tie it to the fact that they were in the car and I was in the car with, clothes that basically were covered in coupling agents. But the wheezing persisted until I dropped off my first lab mate. And so I happened to have Benadryl in the back of my car. I think I had started keeping Benadryl around just in case because I was starting to have some slight allergies and I didn't know if they were environmental. But I dropped the lab mate off. I got out of the car. I got some Benadryl and it helped the wheezing stop really quickly. And I was like, oh, okay, well, maybe this is something environmental. There's new pollen in the air and I just don't know what it is yet. So I was very much dismissing my symptoms like Marie Curie. And I was thinking, everything's seasonal. I'm having environmental allergies. It'll be fine. I'll take antihistamines and I will be okay. But then when I had my intense, severe wheezing episode, really the anaphylactic response, I really only knew to seek out Benadryl because of those 2 previous wheezing events. And I'm really glad that I had to go buy some Benadryl at the store because it forced me to leave the lab space. Luckily or unluckily, I think the Benadryl was in my bag in the car and I hadn't brought the bag into my lab. And so I didn't have Benadryl on me because if I had Benadryl on me, I probably would have just kept going and taken the Benadryl and I wouldn't have known that I was becoming so severely allergic to these lab chemicals. And the crazy thing is, when I had my really bad anaphylactic response and I left the building, as soon as I stepped outside, the wheezing was instantly better. And within the next 24 hours, I started to kind of put the pieces together of hey, maybe there's some connection between the wheezing events that I had in the last month and this really bad wheezing event. My symptoms had to get pretty severe before I realized what was happening. I was a little too close, I think, to what was happening to really see the big picture of my symptoms. And I think that happened with Marie too.
Once Kate started making the connections, she approached her PI.
He was very surprised. He kind of looked at me and was like, oh, I believe you. But then I think the scientist in him was like, okay, but what is happening? I can imagine now, as I am a professor currently, I can imagine what was going through his head was oh my gosh, is this something that has happened to other people? This isn't something that has never happened yet in my lab. We need to kind of suss this out and tease out what is happening, and if it actually was the peptide coupling agents, or was it the amino acids, or was it something else that, in this case, I was exposed to. So he approached it with surprise and curiosity. A lot of, wait, what? What happened? And let's try and tease this out. Are you willing to kind of investigate this further? Which I was very, very willing to investigate.
Through this investigation of her own symptoms, she started to find all of the other puzzle pieces. One of them was from her master's lab.
After my own sensitization event, I did realize that the reason why my master's degree lab was so careful about peptide coupling agents was because they had a near miss with the same exact type of sensitization that I had. So they did report their symptoms and their near miss.
Kate had another puzzle piece, this one inside of her own PhD lab.
So I noticed that one of my lab mates had allergy symptoms early when I joined the lab. They had pretty bad, kind of postnasal drip allergies, so they were sneezing often, and they had runny noses often, and their eyes would get kind of watery. But I figured that they had environmental allergens, and I think that they told me once that they thought they had environmental allergens, at least early on when I spoke to them about it. I did not know that they might have had allergies to the lab environment. We really didn't discuss their allergies much until after the sensitization. Like I said, I probably noticed in passing that they were sneezing, and maybe I said something, but we didn't have an in-depth conversation. But after my sensitization, and I couldn't come to lab anymore, my lab mate disclosed to me that they suspected they might have had allergies caused by the same peptide coupling agents. We spoke in a completely informal setting, and to the best of my knowledge, that colleague never reported their suspicion to my PI. When I had conversations with them, they were very much like, well, I was able to work around it. I figured out a process. I luckily worked with an undergraduate researcher who wasn't sensitive to these peptide coupling agents, and so they would actually weigh out the chemicals and the peptide coupling agents as well as the FMOC protected amino acids for them. So then they just didn't have to be exposed much. So they were able to kind of work around their symptoms and continue to work until they graduated.
Kate started to scour the literature for more puzzle pieces.
It made a lot of sense that the reports would be in medical journals because the people who have the medical and immunological background to report these allergies are in those fields. But it made no sense to me that there were no reports of sensitization, especially like severe anaphylactic sensitizations, in journals that were actually read by the chemists who use those sensitizing agents. I actually had trouble accessing them all. I thought to myself, the people, the researchers who are actually using peptide coupling agents and other chemical sensitizers, we are the ones who need to see these types of reports and stories and publications that naturally come across our paths, right? Because we're not going to go look for them necessarily. I mean, I certainly never did. But we need to find these publications in journals that we actually read on a day-to-day basis.
Kate would go on to publish a paper in the ACS Journal of Organic Chemistry in 2019 about her case to add one more puzzle piece out there for others to assemble the puzzle.
I really wanted to tell a story. I wanted to share what happened to me. I did not want to write a sterile, unfeeling report that's only purpose is to present some new data and information. And as I'm saying this might sound kind of harsh to other immunological and toxicology journals. I don't mean to downplay the important part that they play, but I do feel like many of those reports do come in a very just all information format. And that doesn't mean as much as hearing, hey, my throat was closing and that was scary. So I really wanted to help other budding scientists learn about the hazards of the chemicals they're working for, or maybe more seasoned researchers who have been working with reagents for a long time, or maybe they're changing fields and working with something they've never been exposed to before. What does sensitization even mean? Like, I certainly had no idea about what that really meant until after I had my own brush with anaphylaxis. It wasn't fun, and I don't want anyone else to have to learn about a potentially life-threatening and life-altering allergy the way that I did.
Kate's case study, as well as the others that had been accumulating through the last several years, inspired a group of occupational health and safety researchers to perform a more systematic review of peptide coupling agents. Graham and her colleagues published the paper in 2022, which is linked in the show notes. They also did an ACS webinar in 2025, in which they mentioned Kate's case study as the triggering event for them to look more closely at peptide coupling agents as a hazard class.
I was not aware of this at all, but this is so super cool. To be honest, I feel a bit emotional and teary, but in a good way, reading this, because I'm so glad that sharing my story has had this kind of impact. I hope that more people were kept safe because of it. I find the paper a bit hard to read. Again, this is not my field of expertise, but if I'm interpreting this data correctly, it looks like the researchers found that HATU, HBTU, and HCTU are all dermal sensitizers. This is the GHS category 1A. If this is a correct interpretation, that's interesting because it looks like they haven't actually looked at how these sensitizers affect airway tissue, which from my understanding of the reports and my own report, it seems like most of these coupling agents are airway sensitizers. So people who have any issues end up having some type of throat closing response or airway irritation. So I would love to see a study look at how these peptide coupling agents affect epithelial tissues in the lungs.
Kate was able to complete her PhD with the support of her PI and her lab mates.
I never spoke with anyone at the institution level about what was happening and what types of accommodations would be made for me because of the sensitization. My PI was amazing. He was one of the most supportive people throughout this process. He really let me drive. He supported and encouraged me to get allergy tested just so then we could learn and confirm if my allergy suspicion was correct, because then that would help other people in the lab. He also supported me in pursuing chemistry education research so that way I could complete my PhD. I feel like everyone in graduate school builds a special type of camaraderie with their group mates, and that was really showcased when I did have my allergy. I had a lot of help wrapping up my experiments. The lab also changed how they started handling lab chemicals in general, I think specifically the peptide coupling agents.
As Kate has built her higher ed teaching career since, she also looks for opportunities to continue to share her story with early career researchers.
So the conference I spoke at in April was a really lovely surprise. Back in fall 2025, I received an email from a graduate safety team at UNC Chapel Hill. And they're like, we heard about your sensitization. We've read your paper. We would love to have you come and give a talk. And I was like, yes, of course. I would love to give a talk, especially to a group of young scientists. I was so excited to hear that it was a grad student safety team that put the symposium together. They reached out to all of the speakers. There were a lot of great people there, and they did a really good job of tying all of the talks together. And I felt like every single talk kind of set up different angles and aspects of safety that I was able to then kind of build upon and comment upon. So it was just a really, really nice flow, and I feel like they were very thoughtful, and everyone I talked to at the symposium was very much in the same vein of being excited and interested and feeling that every talk and every topic that the speakers brought up were very tied together. And I was really glad to see that there are these groups of graduate students who take safety very seriously, and they're trying to actively change the culture in their respective universities. Because I feel like Like, graduate students are the ones on the ground, right? Sometimes undergraduates as well, or maybe undergraduates only, depending on the type of institution. And you can only have so much top-down influence. You also need the people on the ground to take safety seriously and to make sure that, for lack of a better word, that there's peer pressure within the lab to make sure that everyone is complying with safety standards.
Kate then reflected on how going through this experience would change how she would manage a lab group.
I think a lot could change if labs made it a common practice to compare symptoms, for example. I think more people would realize that they have potentially problematic symptoms earlier than they would otherwise. If we've heard something once, right, then the next time we have a similar experience, we can make a connection to that thing, whatever that problem is. This is how we learn, right? I'm a teacher. I teach in a university setting, and I think about education and how students learn a lot. I'm constantly trying to make content relatable, right? If I can make a new chemical concept relatable to something they've learned in the past, they will remember it much better. And so in the context of safety, like in lab cultures, if we talk openly about the different types of symptoms that could be the effect of some lab-exposed compound, then we will make the connection when we ourselves are experiencing that symptom. If I have one big message, it is that peptide coupling agents should never be exposed to lab air. Never. They should only ever be opened in a fume hood. They should be stored in a fridge to help minimize aerosolization when they're weighed out, and an analytical balance should live in the hood for this purpose. Like these chemicals, they're lyophilized white powders, so they just so easily become aerosolized. Pay attention to your health and be cautious about reagents that could harm your physical person.
I would like to assure you all that the intention of this episode is not to scare you. If we are to pursue open questions in the physical sciences, we are going to be working with substances that we do not have full knowledge of. After all, the job of the researcher is to create that knowledge. My intention here is to encourage researchers, and those who support them, to recognize the risk inherent in their roles, and to act accordingly, for their safety, as well as the safety of others who may be impacted by their work. For the researcher, this is about listening to your own body and the signals it is sending for you. You are part of a niche population who is exposed to conditions that others aren't. For the head of a research group, as you already know, collecting individual data points is what creates the graph of data. Let's work towards the normalization of discussing any recurring symptoms or physical ailments. For the institutional leadership, engineering controls are extremely important to running an effective and efficient research lab. While the science can get pretty sophisticated, protecting people from their science can be surprisingly basic. Over the last 100 years, mechanisms to prevent respiratory and dermal exposure have become well established and commonplace. It is critical to have these engineering controls in place and well maintained to support your researchers. And back to researchers, get to know your engineering controls and use them effectively. Heads of research labs, emphasize the value of best practices and be a good example to your researchers in using those engineering controls effectively. So where are we now between radiation and peptide coupling agents? In a way, it feels like we have not covered any distance at all. In other ways, things are quite different. I would like to acknowledge Myla Kara's contribution to this episode that included important discussions and question development. In episode 12, the chemical sensitizer wake-up call, Myla joined us to discuss chemical sensitizers from the perspective of the safety professional. If you haven't done so already, I highly recommend that you go back to listen to that episode for practical advice on how to handle chemical sensitizers in your lab. And I emphatically thank Kate McNally for sharing her story on today's episode. She has played a critical and difficult role in advancing scientific understanding, and I applaud the way she has chosen to use it to support her research community. Thank you for all you do to develop lab workers who are skilled, safe, and trailblazing.
Skilled, safe, and trailblazing is meant for those working in labs or training others to do so. The information shared here is a starting point, not a complete guide or legal standard. We've done our best to use reliable sources, but we make no guarantees about accuracy or completeness. Always follow local, state, and federal laws and consult legal or safety experts if you have questions.